Good afternoon again and welcome. I'm Steve Donovan, the Director of Alumni Relations at Trinity. I hope you're all safe and well and enjoying a wonderful taste of spring as we are in Hartford this week. Thank you for joining us on the virtual long walk today for the second event in our new Trinity Authors series. Some of you may have joined us for the inaugural event last month with Will Thomas, class of 1986. Will spoke about his new book, A Question of Freedom, which is a personal narrative confronting the complicity of his own ancestors in the slave trade at the dawn of America. We're proud to have learned just yesterday, in fact, that Will was awarded the 2021 J. Anthony Lucas Prize Project Award by the Columbia School of Journalism. So congratulations, Will. Today's author has accumulated a few awards of her own, and it's my pleasure now to introduce you to a talented Trinity faculty member who has agreed to facilitate today's conversation and will tell you about some of those accolades. Belén Fernández Milmanda earned her BA in Sociology from the University of Buenos Aires, an MA in Political Science from Universidad Torcuato di Tella in Argentina. Fortunately, I took a little bit of Spanish in high school. And Belén holds a PhD in Political Science from Harvard University. She studies comparative politics and political economy with a focus on Latin America. Her own book project compares how agrarian elites organize to influence policymaking in contemporary Latin America. She also studies the political determinants of forest protection in the Argentine Chaco forest. Her work has appeared in World's Development, Politics and Society, and the Oxford Research Encyclopedia on Latin American Politics. At Trinity, Professor Milmanda teaches courses on Latin American politics, political economy, environmental politics, and the politics of inequality and qualitative methods. We are so honored to have both of these accomplished women join us today for this discussion, particularly as we celebrate Women's History Month. I trust you will all enjoy your time with them. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Belén to introduce Gabriella and start our discussion. Thank you, Belén.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Gabby. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Gabby Burnham. She joins us today to discuss her first novel here. It's Good, It's Tone. I really enjoyed reading it, and I also really like the cover. So I highly recommend it to all of you. So this book has been named the best book of the year by the Harper, Bazaar, Mary Claire Publishers Weekly, and Good Housekeeping magazines. Gabby is a Trinity alumna, and she is a resident of New York City. So she, when she was a child, she lived in São Paolo, Brazil, where much of this novel is set. And she holds an MFA in creative writing from the Writers' Foundry at St. Joseph's College, and has been awarded fellowships to McDowell and Yaddo. She has worked as a reporter, a creative writing teacher, and an immigration lawyer. As I just said, this It Is Good, It Is a Stone is her first novel. So thank you, Gabby, for being here and to discuss your book and your experience at Trinity with us. So I am going to open the discussion with some questions for Gabby, and I encourage the audience to share their questions with us through this Zoom Q&A. So this is different from the chat window. So if you could just if you have any questions, just send them there, and then we'll all open the discussion to everyone after I start with a few questions. So Gabby, why don't you introduce yourself in a way, like tell us about yourself, like where you're from and what brought you to Trinity, anything you want to share with us.
Thank you so much. It's honestly such an honor to speak with you. I did a little bit of research on your work before this, and it's really fascinating. I was almost like, I wish I could just ask you questions this whole time. So thank you. Let's see, a little bit about me. So I grew up most of my life, most of my childhood rather, on an island off the coast of Massachusetts called Nantucket. Which a lot of people who go to Trinity are familiar with Nantucket. It's kind of known for being this vacation destination for the rich and famous. But that was not my experience there. I'm part of the local community. I moved there with my mother and my sister from São Paolo. My mother is from Brazil. And so I wasn't born in Brazil, but we were living there before I moved to Nantucket. My mother worked in kitchens as a chef, raising us. And yeah, it was kind of an unusual childhood because I really had a lot of access to extreme wealth, but it was kind of impenetrable to me at the same time because that wasn't my experience growing up with a single mom who was an immigrant. So then of course I went to Trinity, and from Trinity, I lived in Connecticut for a little bit after college, and then went to Boston for a little while. And then I've been living in Brooklyn, New York for almost the past decade. It's going to be 9 years this summer, actually. And let's see, and then you asked what brought me to Trinity?
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, Trinity is, the NESCAC schools, I think, were really desirable to kids from my high school. I went to a really small high school. There were less than 70 students in my graduating class. I think it was like 68 students. And so I think I knew I wanted to be at a smaller school. But also I had a friend in high school, Ben Butterworth, who went to Trinity, and he would always talk about how great it was. And I visited the campus and it was really beautiful. But another huge factor was that Trinity gave me a huge financial aid package, and I really couldn't have afforded to go if they didn't do that. So that was a huge factor for me as well, that they gave me money so that I could go and study. And yeah, so without being in massive amounts of debt, which would have been, made it a lot harder, especially since I graduated in 2009 in the middle of the recession.
Yeah, money is important.
Yes.
So then, like, how was it, after you finished school, and like, what brought you to writing? Like, if you wanna, tell us about like that path, like how you went from like, finishing college to like be, writing a book.
Yeah, it was a very winding path. So I studied English literature at Trinity. I have always really loved books. Books were a really stable place for me to go. Yeah, I've just always taken literature and writing very seriously. But I graduated in 2009, as I mentioned, in the middle of the great financial collapse, the Great Recession. And so there were approximately 0 jobs open for me in the writing space. So I actually at one point had interviewed at Random House for an internship that they had. They have this internship where you can move to different departments. And I was so excited that I got this interview at Random House. I mean, what a dream. I didn't know that, years later, I would actually have a book published by Random House. So it's kind of gone full circle. But a week after I had my interview, they announced that they were closing the internship because of budget cuts. Yeah, so I think at one point I was applying to like 4 or 5 jobs a day. I mean, I was just like desperate to find work. And so eventually when that wasn't happening, I printed out a stack of resumes, and my boyfriend at the time took me in his car and we drove down the Berlin Turnpike, which you're all probably very familiar with, and literally stopped at every restaurant on the Berlin Turnpike. So like there was like a Bertucci's, I think. I don't even remember the other ones. And I just handed my resume to like everyone who was there. And then eventually I stopped at Carmen Anthony's Fish House on the Berlin Turnpike, which it does not exist anymore, I've heard. And they were like, oh, interesting. So you just graduated from Trinity and you have a lot of experience as a reporter, but you want a hostess job. And I was like, yes, please just hire me as a hostess. And they did. So I worked at Carmen Anthony's as a hostess as my first job out of college. And then eventually moved to Boston, and I was working at the Cambridge Side Galleria Mall at Francesca's, doing retail. And I remember I went to Trinity for homecoming and saw some friends, and they were like, I have a job as a paralegal working at a law firm, and some other people had jobs like working in offices. And I was so ashamed that I was working like retail and that I had only been a hostess. I'm like, being a paralegal sounds so fancy. Maybe that's something that I could do. So didn't even know what a paralegal was, to be honest. I had no, experience with that. So I applied to paralegal jobs and ended up getting a job as a paralegal at a small immigration law firm in Boston called Chin & Curtis. And then from there, got hired by a much larger law firm that's multinational, and kind of worked my way up, became the education lead for the immigration group, training attorneys and staff and paralegals on immigration law. And then eventually started actually developing software for immigration law. I mean, basically this was a career that I was developing, but it was never really something that I intended to do. Like, it wasn't really like what I loved. So I kept writing. I got my MFA while doing that. I taught as well after getting my MFA in the mornings, and then would go to my law firm job afterwards. And then eventually I finished this book that I was just writing to kind of like keep me connected to the thing that like had always made me feel like I was alive. You know, it was the thing that like, I've always felt like writing was the reason why I'm here in this earth. And so I kept doing that to feel connected to something that makes me feel vibrant. But then I had a finished book and I was like, this is actually a pretty good book. Like, I read it and I'm like, which might sound like a funny thing to say, but I was like, this is actually enjoyable and maybe other people would want to read this. So I sent it out to agents, and one came back like immediately and was like, I love this, I want to represent you. And then we ended up selling it to One World at Random House a few months later.
Great. Well, thank you so much for like that very honest description of your journey from like Trinity to writing, because I think like if there are some current students or like recent graduates in the audience, I think they will really appreciate this, you know, because like I imagine a lot of people, like a lot of my students are anxious about like, you know, graduating in the midst of this crisis. And, you know, it was kind of similar to you in 2009. So I think, you know, they can learn a lot from your experience, you know, about, you know, resilience and perseverance and being open to new things and new opportunities. So I don't know if you want to add any words of advice for them.
Yeah. Oh God. You know, and I, it's funny how life works, because I graduated from Trinity in the middle of a recession, and then I quit my job just a year ago in the beginning of COVID. I decided that I wanted to pursue writing full time and left a career that, you know, I have the most experience in. Really, I'm not a professional writer, or I hadn't been. So it was a risk. And then of course, COVID hit. So I'm like, great, I'm right back here. But, you know, I guess what I would say, the best advice I can give is that, well, first of all, I think it's really attractive to kind of look at my story and say, look, if she can do it, you know, so can you. And first of all, I think that there should be structural reform in this country so that you don't have to make the decision to work a minimum wage job to get by just because we're in a recession. That's one. But then two, I think that if you can just be tender with yourself, because there can be so much shame in working a job just to make money. You know, I was so ashamed, honestly, that I was working at a hostess, and I remember this someone came in and said, oh, I'm visiting Hartford because my son just started at Trinity. And I said, oh, I just graduated from Trinity. And the look on his face that like, but you're working as a hostess, I could just tell that he was confused and like, did my son make a mistake? And I'm like, no, Trinity's a great school. It's just, you know, hard to get a job right now. So just to be tender with yourself that like, if you have to get a job out of college, just to like pay the bills and get by for a little while until you figure it out, that's okay. Like, it's not going to like ruin your career prospects, or it doesn't mean that, you know, you're not going to be able to do what it is that you really want to do ultimately. There's so much time and things change. And also, working in a restaurant is great experience. Like, you get experience with people, you get experience working really hard. You learn how to fold napkins really well. You know, there are a lot of the positives to getting real experience, like working in like a labored job.
Oh, yeah, well, I think that, you know, this is a great way to, you know, transition into like talking about your book. And, you know, while you were, you know, telling us about yourself and your experience, I felt like, oh, I understand a lot of things that are in the book much better. So like thinking about those years, right, like that you were writing the book and you were like trying to find your own path, you know, like the main character in the book is, in a way, right? So like, could you like to share with us like what, you know, if there were any experiences at that time that helped you, like, you know, like build your characters for the book, or like, you know, like writing the book in general, or like making the book richer in a way, because you were like, you know, experiencing all these different things.
Yeah, I think I look at the main character in the book, Linda, and reading it back, and it's true that I think every character is a reflection of me in a different way. Fiction is incredible versus writing like memoir or nonfiction, because it's you, but it's like you at a slant, or it's you amplified in a different way, or it's you with also the like twisted here and twisted there, made complicated. You know, that's where imagination is such a big part of writing fiction. And so it's like my experience, but also with a lot of invention as well. But yeah, so I think that definitely like all the experiences that I was going through in terms of like where do I fit into my own life, I guess is like what I was thinking about. Like, I had these ambitions and I knew what I wanted to be, like I knew what I wanted for myself, but I felt like I kind of wasn't filling into my life yet. And that's certainly where Linda is, especially at the beginning of the novel. But then I think another aspect of Linda is, you know, and maybe I'll just give some context what the book is about, in case anyone hasn't read it yet, but which I'm sure there are people who haven't read it yet. I'm like, yeah, definitely, everyone's read it, right? No. But yeah, so the story opens with Linda, who is the first person narrator of the book. She and her husband, Dennis, moved to São Paulo, Brazil, from Hartford, Connecticut, because Dennis has been awarded a teaching residency at the University of São Paulo. He's a history professor. But Linda is feeling very kind of unmoored. She actually, in the beginning of the book, is thinking about leaving her husband. But then when she gets this opportunity through Dennis, she's like, maybe if I move to Brazil, all of these kind of concerns that I'm having about what it is that I desire from my own life will be resolved. But of course, that's not what happens. In some ways, it's amplified more because now she's moved to São Paulo with her husband, who is this really accomplished professor, and she's living in a fancy neighborhood, a upper class neighborhood, Moema, and she has a maid. And this feels really at odds with her own personal story. She grew up in a working class family. Her father was an addict. Her mother left when she was really young. And so she was in a certain socioeconomic status, but then in marrying Dennis, she kind of moved into a new social class. And now she's an American in a foreign country, which adds another layer of privilege. And so she's having to grapple with like, how do I see myself and how am I being perceived by others? And how do I kind of like connect these two things? And sometimes she handles it really badly. And then other times she handles it with grace, and the more she kind of learns about herself. so I think part of my interest in writing Linda was also my experience with, growing up very, very working class, but then having access to wealth. Certainly going to Trinity was like very different for me in terms of like all the students that I was meeting. But then also graduating with like a degree that I was really proud of, but then not actually being able to access the kinds of jobs that one would expect if you're graduating from a school like Trinity. So I'm kind of exploring all of these dynamics in the book.
Yeah, great. And, I must say that I kind of also identified with that because well, I come from a working class family in Argentina, but I went to Harvard, right? So it was like, to me, those two words were like, whoa.
Yeah.
So that requires some adaptation too. So, my education opened, to me, very different worlds. So
Yeah.
I think like in a way, like I really connect with that experience and also with the book. So, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think it's really interesting. And also another thing I loved about the book is that it happens in 3 cities I've lived in.
Wow,
So,
really? Oh yeah.
Boston, because I, like Dennis, I went to Harvard, and São Paulo when I was doing field work for my dissertation, and well, obviously Hartford now. So, would you like to tell us a little bit about why you chose those cities and what's the significance of those cities in the book and for you?
Yeah, definitely. So for me, São Paulo, this is gonna just hang on. This is gonna sound very cliche, and I realize it, but in some ways, I feel like writing about São Paulo chose me. I didn't seek it out. I grew up mostly in the United States, but my entire family lives in Brazil, which I think a lot of first generation Americans can kind of relate to that experience of being in a country, but your entire ancestry and in some ways who you are is in another country. So growing up, I kind of didn't know how to relate to that, like what it really meant to be like, to say that I'm Brazilian, because then when I looked at my actual Brazilian family, they seemed so far away in some ways, but also like really close to me. That they'd shaped me in a way that I couldn't fully access. And so when I was in my MFA program, when I started writing about São Paulo, it was like something new opened up inside of me, where like all of a sudden I knew what my voice was as a writer. And I felt like I couldn't stop. Like I needed to keep investigating. And again, at that point, I wasn't writing for an audience. Really, I wasn't writing thinking like this is going to be a published book one day and people are going to read it. I was really writing to feel connected to myself and writing São Paulo. So that's kind of why I chose São Paulo first, or São Paulo chose me. And then I had to make some decisions about where Linda was from, where Linda and her husband would meet. And I think that, in writing a novel, it takes years. I mean, you're writing for years. And then when you go to publish a book, you're working on it for years. So the characters you choose, the settings that you choose, I think they have to be really close to you because you're going to be spending years with these people in these places. So I chose locations that, I feel connected to in different ways and that I love. Boston was a city that I lived in before I moved to New York. And it's also, growing up on Nantucket, it was kind of like the closest large city that I had access to. And then obviously Hartford, I went to Trinity. And so that was another location that kind of felt special to me. But I also think Hartford, Connecticut in general as a state is sort of interesting because, thinking about Linda's family, she's from this white sort of blue collar working class family. And that's a large proportion of Connecticut that people don't really think about. I think when people think of Connecticut, they think of the Fairfield County, the Greenwich, the New Canaan. They think about extreme wealth, like some of the most wealthy countries in this or cities in the country are in Connecticut, but then there's also a really working class community there. So I thought that even though that doesn't come up a lot in the book, I thought that was sort of an interesting dynamic that exists in Connecticut that also plays out thematically in It Is What It Is Stone.
Oh, great. So, you already told us a little bit about Linda. And so, another interesting thing about the book is that it is written in first person, right? Like through the eyes of Linda in a way, except for a small part that is not. So what did you make that choice?
Yeah, well, just to elaborate on that a little bit further, because it's written in the first person from Linda's point of view, but then there's a you in the book, that you is her husband, Dennis. So the book is told through Linda's perspective, but as sort of like a confession to her husband. So like, while I was at the grocery store buying cereal, you were at the university and you didn't know that I was daydreaming about another lover the entire time. This is not actual sentences, but that's kind of the structure of the book. And second person, that you is sort of like the redheaded stepchild in writing a little bit. I had been told many, many times that not to write in the second person, that people don't respond to it well. This is all when I was in academia. And so whenever someone tells me like, don't do this because people aren't gonna like it, I'm like, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do it really well. So that was kind of where that started. But then it started, making sense for Linda, because she's someone who, I think because everything is directed to her husband, it's almost like a reclaiming of her story. Like, I'm going to tell you what I was doing while you were at the university, schmoozing with the provost, trying to make your connections. This is what I was doing. But then the other side to it is that her story is always in relation to her husband. And Linda's also someone who, in order to understand who she is, she has to have someone sitting across from her. Like she kind of is malleable depending on who she's with. And so that choice of like having it be from Linda's perspective, but it's always told to her husband is always there, sort of operates in two different ways.
Yeah. So another thing I like about the book is that most of the characters are women. And, as we know, this is Women's History Month, March. So, and the book is really focused on telling women's stories, right, and making their voice heard, right? Like, so, if you want to tell us a little bit about, like, how you compose those characters and like what type of research did you do, or like experience kind of helped you build, like, those voices in a way.
Yeah, I love that. I didn't even this is a quarantine thing where I'm like not aware of like what month it is or what the day is. Like I didn't even realize it was Women's History Month. So that's really amazing. I will say that I do not actively choose to like only write about women. I'm just much more interested in the internal lives of women, and relationships between women are really fascinating to me. And I write about what I'm interested in. And so that's the reason why, to be honest. But I was, I think that all of the characters, while they're not archetypes, they sort of, they do represent different sort of, I guess, sex or socioeconomic statuses, or different backgrounds, different ages. So in setting that up, it was kind of fun to then like move the characters around, and depending on who's coupled with whom, it will create a different dynamic. But in terms of research, I mean, I always, whenever I get asked a question about research in writing fiction, especially, I'm like, my entire life is research in some ways, because, you pick up different things from your life. And then especially with a debut, like, it's like my entire life goes into it in some ways. But I mean, the best part of writing this book was that I got to go visit my family a lot. Not that I couldn't do that before, but the book really was like, I have to go to Brazil because I'm writing this book. And so I need to know. And my family's filled with women. I mean, it's basically just women in my family. So, there's the house where Celia lives, one of the characters is based off of my cousin Simone's house, and you know, and Parachi, like we took vacation to Parachi, and so so there are a lot of things in the book that were actually places that my family took me and where they live. And then, you know, I did some more academic research as well, especially for Marta's story. Her maid is Black and from Etibaia, like a rural town outside of São Paulo. So I did research just to kind of understand like the racial history in Brazil, because race works in a very different way in Brazil. Well, I shouldn't say very different. It works in a different way in Brazil than it does in the United States, but also in similar ways as well. So I did a lot of research and kind of understanding the history of slavery in Brazil and how assimilation is kind of is like reflected on how the fluidity of race works in Brazil today, as opposed to the United States, where it's, I think, in large part because of segregation, it's more black and white, to use a pun, a literal pun. But yeah, so that's kind of some of the research I did.
Okay, yeah. So, you know, like just building on that, right? Like, so to me, the two main characters are like Linda and Martha. Maybe you disagree, but you know, these two women really couldn't be more different in a way, right? Like Linda is highly educated and now she's upper middle class.
Mm-hmm.
She's white and American in Brazil, and she's, you know, still trying to find her path in life. Whereas Martha is Black, uneducated, although very smart, right? Poor Brazilian that seems to have always known what she wanted in life, in a way, right? Like, yet in the end, they become allies. So what do you think these two women that are very different have in common?
Yes, this is the question in some ways of the book. Well, so my like initial reaction in that question is that they don't have anything in common, and that's okay. I think that's in some ways looking for like relatability or like what we have in common is overrated, that you don't have to have anything in common with someone to be kind to them and feel empathy towards them, or to understand them better, or even just to listen and ask questions. So that's kind of like my first instinct, but I think there are things that they have in common. And I think one is that they both want to live a dignified life. You know, that's at the core that they understand about each other. Linda wants to live a dignified life, and that to her is really understanding herself better and to form a life that is outside of her husband's kind of ambitions. And for Marta, I mean, she grew up in a rural community outside of São Paulo. Etibaia, Portão is the neighborhood where she grew up. And, you know, in the 70s in Brazil, during the military dictatorship, resources are being funneled away from her community and into urban centers. So in some ways, like her dignity is contingent on her economic circumstances. She can't go to high school because her family can't afford to have her go to high school. Only her brother can go. So, you know, her dignified life is within a much more constrained system than Linda, who has much more social mobility. But nevertheless, in her life, she finds ways to live with dignity. Marta does. So I think that that's their common ground. And then eventually they also have a common enemy in Dennis in some ways. You know, they unify because they're both fed up with how Dennis is acting for reasons that are partially Linda's fault. But yeah, so I think that's what they have in common.
Okay, so and this will be the last question from me, and then I encourage people in the audience to send questions through the Q&A, please. So what do you want the reader to take away from this novel?
Let's see. Well, so I think the greatest gift in publishing a book is hearing how readers have their own interpretations. And so it's been, sometimes like a reader will come to me with a thought about the book that I hadn't even thought of before, and it's so great. So I say that first because I studied English literature at Trinity, and like I'm first and foremost a reader. I'm like, readers in some ways have all the power with the book. But if I ask the readers to take something away, I think it's that I don't a certain way about any character. I think I really strove with each character to, make sure that they didn't have like a flat or too tied with a bow narrative, that every character has, I guess, pros and cons. And so I hope that they sort of linger with the reader, and that you're left investigating the characters even after you close the book. Because I think when you do that, then you also investigate yourself and start thinking about your own complexities and where they meet. And then the other thing is that I hope that people feel curious about São Paulo after reading the book, especially for an American readership. Brazil is not represented in American literature very often. And so the greatest, one of the greatest things that I hear from readers is either one, Brazilian readers who are in another country who read the book and they are like, it brought me back home. That's been incredible to get that kind of reaction. But then also American readers who are like, I didn't know anything about São Paulo, and like, this is my, first introduction to the city, and it makes me want to go see it and learn more about it. So.
Yeah, I think like also like, probably Americans, when they think about Brazil, they think about tropical beaches, and Sao Paulo couldn't be.
Yes, that was the because when I moved to Nantucket from Brazil, I was living in São Paulo in like a massive high rise with my aunt and my cousins in a huge city. We weren't even allowed to go out by ourselves as well. Like it was, it's huge. And then I go to Nantucket, which is like this tiny little island, but they were like, all the questions were like, did you live in the jungle? Were there animals? I'm like, no. I was living in a huge city. So yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I could keep asking you a million questions, but I think it would be unfair to the audience. So, if anyone has any questions, please share them through the Q&A. Here, there's a very interesting question from Annalise. She's asking about, like you said, you did some research about race and race relationships in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
So did you also take gender-based violence into account? We know like violence against women is like a huge problem in Latin America. So is that something that you did some research about, or that you consider when you were writing this book?
That's an interesting question. I would love a little bit more context on what she's thinking about specifically. I didn't do any research specifically on violence against women. Obviously, yes, that is a huge issue in Latin America. Not a theme that my book addresses directly, but yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I have just not even specifically for this book, but in terms of like gender studies, I studied a lot at Trinity and have since then. So that's always in the back of my mind when writing. No, that's really interesting. Something that, thank you for that question.
Yeah, thinking about this is that even if it's not like a, theme of the book, it is kind of present in a way, at least gender relationships, right? Like if you think about Marta couldn't go to high school because she was a girl, but her brother did, right? Like, yes. So those things are in a way.
Yeah, of course. And I guess it's the violence aspect of it that I'm maybe kind of like pausing on, because that's really interesting. But I think violence comes up in the book in different ways, not explicitly, but there is like a lot of bubbling of violence in the undercurrent of the book. And then with Marta specifically, there's a storyline of sexual violence against one of her characters in the story, her sister. So yeah, it appears, but I didn't do any, I didn't target any specific research on that,
Okay, so there are some questions here. People want to know about the title. What did you choose this title for your novel? Which is Good, It Is Stone.
Yeah, so It Is What It Is Stone, which I'll say like the publisher was not thrilled, or at least the marketing department was not thrilled with the title because it's not the catchiest. And for the longest time, like I would tell people the name of my book and they'd be like, what? But it was so central to like me writing the story. It kind of was like the crux of like what everything was spinning around. And it's a translation of the first few lyrics of the song Águas de Março, which is Tom Jobim is like the original writer of the song, but I was listening to the version. I was listening to a bunch of different versions basically of this song while writing it. It was kind of like playing in the background of my head, but the lyrics are just like a compilation of all these abstract images, like it is wood, it is stone, it is the end of the road, it is a shard of glass, it is a sense of missing, like all of these different abstract thoughts, and they're all kind of washing together in the rivers of March and the waters of March. So I kind of liked that as like an abstract like impetus of just like this idea of everything in life kind of washing together in the river, and then kind of like it is what it is. It's all kind of coming together.
Okay, so there are also some questions about writing and advice, and I want to read this one because I love this question from Doreen. She says, what advice would you give to a stuck writer? So one who has wanted to write a memoir for decades and is scared of doing it. So
that's a great question. I think that I'm going to give you an answer and know that I still struggle with fear and feeling stuck. But I think that one thing that's important to know about writing is that it's a craft that requires practice. So if you are wanting to be a basketball player and you don't play basketball for like 4 months, and then you're like, I'm going to play 5 hours of basketball, you're probably not going to do very well, and you're going to be really tired, and then you're never going to want to play basketball again. So my advice is that like write for 15 minutes every day. And it can be anything, and do it by hand too. Don't do it on the computer. Like write by hand for 15 minutes, because everyone has 15 minutes in their day. It could be like when you're waiting for the dentist, or I don't know, moments before you're about to go to bed, if you have kids especially. And then you're building practice, and then eventually you start noticing that 15 minutes turns into half an hour, and then half an hour turns into an hour, and it's getting easier and easier because you're doing it every day, and it sort of takes the pressure off. Like whenever I'm like, I'm going to write for an entire day, it never happens because, I'm always like, oh my God, I have to spend this entire day writing. And then I get nervous about it. And then I end up doing dishes and laundry and like cleaning instead of writing. But 15 minutes is a really, it's a good amount of time to take the pressure off.
I guess that advice also applies to professors trying to write papers.
Yes, totally.
So related, and you touch upon this a little bit when you were talking about yourself, but so Kimberly wants to know, what are your feelings about writers keeping their day jobs versus taking the risk to write full time?
I mean, my feeling is that I wish that there were more full-time writers. I wish it was a more financially feasible thing to do. I mean, being an English literature major, I think there's like a joke that if you graduate with an English literature degree, it means that you're not going to be able to get a job. And it's sad that the humanities are just constantly being compared against like financial and economic structures, because it's like, that's like saying that like an orange is better than a dog. It's like they're two completely separate things. They operate in different ways and fuel different things. And I think especially now literature is so important as like a historical record, but then also like a reflection of our time. But I digress. I think that, practically speaking, I wasn't able to do that until, and I still don't know if I'm going to be able to do it. I have done it for a year. In some ways, the pandemic helped me because I'm not spending as much money. But I'm living off of savings right now, and I'm going to see what my next move is. So if you financially can do it, then do it. But if you can, I think doing whatever you can to make money, and then taking that 15 minutes every day to, to devote to writing, I think is a good place to start.
So Steve here wants to know, he says, you started writing this just for yourself, as you just told us, right? Like, so how did you know that this particular story was finished?
I didn't want to work on it anymore. That was honestly part of it. It never feels finished. I mean, it does in some ways. Like, I think that I'm a writer who, like, I love to write at the sentence level. My favorite part of a writing project is like when I get to just start really honing, individual sentences. But, and when I felt like all the sentences were really good, and that also the whole story kind of was in a good place, and I was just exhausted. I was like, I don't think I can be in Linda's head anymore. That was those three. And also my publisher was like, you got to hand in a manuscript by this time. All of those things factored into knowing that it was done.
So that sounds like me and my PhD dissertation, right? Like, I don't want to think about this anymore.
Yes, which I really want to read, by the way. I don't know if it's like available anywhere, but.
Yeah. Well, I can send it to you.
Great.
Or you can, wait for the book.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
So yeah, another question that I would like to ask, but also like people in the audience wants to know, right? Like, thinking about like your experience at Trinity, right? So is there anything about your time here that inspired you to write like this particular book, right? Like, I don't know, any classes or like experiences or people you met here?
Yeah. I mean, there were, yes, I took some classes at Trinity with certain professors that I still think about today, which is just, I mean, teachers are so amazing in that way that if you take a great class, I think it will stay with you forever. I wrote down some just so that I would remember. I think two of the professors aren't at Trinity anymore, but Asali Solomon was the first. She was the first like working writer that I met. And that was something that being an author to me was like akin to being an astronaut for the longest time. Like, I was like, I know that this job exists. It's not one that I'm ever going to have because it just seems like an impossible thing to do. And then, at Trinity, I met Asali and other professors who like had books that were out in the world, fiction books that people were reading. And then they were in the classroom with me. So that alone was transformative. But she and I think Nadibi, who's another professor, I think, who isn't there anymore. But then Irene Papoulis and Lucy Ferris, they were all teachers who took literature so seriously, and also encouraged me as a writer, especially Irene and Asali. They both like sat me down after class and were like, you can actually really write. And that meant so much to me. I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing. So to have them say that was incredible. And then I also studied abroad for a whole year. My entire junior year, I went to Dublin, Ireland, and studied at Trinity there, which is a totally different Trinity.
Yeah.
People
always think I work at that Trinity. I'm like, no, Hartford.
Oh, really? Yeah. People were like so confused, especially because like when I was at that Trinity, I would have like a Trinity t-shirt on from like Trinity and Hartford, and people would be like, what? But Ireland is like a city that's so rich in history in terms of literature. Like one of the greatest books of all time, Ulysses, is like set in Dublin, written by James Joyce. So I think just being there, it's like literature is taken so seriously, and I have held on to that forever. Like, I will always kind of hold literature to that esteem because of those professors I had who also take it really seriously, but then also the experience of like going to Trinity and being in Dublin. Yeah.
So, and you know, related to your experience at Trinity here, Chanel Palacios wants to know, you know, from the outside, because it's been a while since you graduated from Trinity, how do you think Trinity has progressed since you graduated? You think it's better or worse than then?
Oh, that's a very loaded question, I think, but an important one. I mean, I am so proud to see how much Trinity has progressed since I've been there. I'll just say that. Yeah, it was I mean, I'm not totally sure, you know, I'm not a student there anymore, so I don't know like what the atmosphere is like for students, but I have talked to some current students, like someone would reach out to me when I still worked at the law firm to get a job, and we're so enthusiastic about how much more diverse Trinity is and the opportunities in terms of like being able to socialize, you know, there are a lot more like kind of community organizations and things like that to be a part of. You know, when I was at Trinity, I loved it in some ways and I found really great friends, but I definitely felt like an outsider in a lot of ways too. You know, it was a lot of very wealthy white kids. And so it, you know, it was hard too, but I think a good experience, you know, really kind of like, I had to confront that and sort of figure out who I was in the midst of that. So I'm really proud to see the ways in which Trinity has kind of progressed in those areas.
Great. So here a question from Tess. So what authors influenced you? Who do you like to read? Do you have any recommendations, you know, aside from your book?
Oh, who do I love to read? Oh my God. Okay. Well, just because it's right next to me, I am almost done with this story collection, Sarahland by Sam Cohen, and it's effing fantastic. It's so good. I really recommend it. It's a collection of short stories, and every single short story has a Sarah character in it. And it's everything from like the first story is like set in the 90s and it's about a girl who's queer but hasn't come out yet, and she's friends with a group of girls who are all named Sarah, and they're like Sarah A, Sarah B, and Sarah C, and she's also a Sarah C, but they call her Dr. Sarah because she's pre-med, and it's sort of about college dynamics and being with a group of friends that maybe doesn't reflect who you are. But then the story goes from like that to like a story about the original Sarah, who was named Sarai in the Bible. And it's like a sort of a queer version of that. So it's so good. I really recommend it. And then I am a complete Elena Ferrante fanatic. The Days of Abandonment was like, I actually read that book after I started writing this book, and I was like, oh my God, I'm so connected to this writer. And she has a new book out called The Lying Life of Adults. It's fantastic, but also her entire Neapolitan series is so good. So yeah, Elena Ferrante. And then like, Clarice Lispector is like my all-time favorite. She's not everyone's cup of tea, very abstract and unusual, but I think that like her sentences like knock me out. I'll read a sentence of hers and like need to stop for a day and just be like, what was that? And then I'll go back to it. And that's kind of what I love. That's why I love reading, when I just get completely seduced by sentences in that way. So those are great. Oh my God, what else have I been reading?
Well, I must say that I, you know, share your love for Elena Ferrante. I really like her novels, like My Brilliant Friend. Oh, I love that one. And, you know, I guess it's no coincidence that my child is named Elena.
Okay, just between us, I've like thought about that. I'm like, would I name my daughter Elena? Because I love Elena Ferrante so much.
So as you see, we have so much in common.
Yes, I know. Yeah, she's amazing. If people walk away from this whole thing just picking up Elena Ferrante's books, then I think that will be a good outcome. Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of people wants to know about what's your next writing project? Are you working on a new book? Do you want to share with us anything about it, or not yet?
Yes, it's like part of me really wants to, because I feel like it's just us talking, and then I realize that there are other people listening in. So I'm a little like nervous to talk about it yet, but I'm working on a new book, and it's set on an island off the coast of Massachusetts, and it's about two sisters who grew up there. And I guess that's all I'll say. Very closely based on Nantucket.
Oh, there is another question. Great. So have you thought about writing in Portuguese?
Oh, I would love to write in Portuguese. I am not nearly fluent enough to write in Portuguese, but that's like a huge goal of mine to hone my Portuguese skills so that I could write in Portuguese. I'm hoping that this book gets translated into Portuguese. Fingers crossed. Kind of.
Yeah, yeah. I was wanting to ask you that. Is there any interest in like publishing it in Brazil?
I think that I sold world rights to One World, so that's completely in Random House's court in terms of how that happens. But yeah, hopefully it's something that's really important to me. So I hope so.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Gabby. This was I really enjoyed this. Also, like I'm on maternity leave this semester, so anything that is not taking care of a baby, I really like.
Congratulations.
Thank
that's
you.
Elena.
Yes, that's Elena. But this has been, great. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Tess and Steve, for organizing and facilitating this. And everyone, enjoy your weekend.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Belén, and Steve and Tess too. Take care, everyone.